The courtroom was utterly silent as the judge slammed his gavel down on the table with excessive force, causing a sharp sound to rip through the air like a whip. His eyes gleamed with the arrogance that had become his trademark over 15 years on the bench. He leaned forward, fixing his piercing gaze on the elderly man before him, clearly nervous and uncomfortable with this formal situation that seemed so far removed from his simple reality. The protagonist of this story was a man in his 70s with graying hair and calloused hands that betrayed decades of hard work. His clothes were simple but clean, a dress shirt likely purchased at a discount department store, dress pants already showing signs of age, and shoes that, though carefully polished, betrayed years of wear. He held an old hat in his trembling hands, twirling it nervously as he tried to fully comprehend what was happening around him. His English was limited, marked by a thick accent that betrayed his humble origins in another country, and this only increased his anxiety in this intimidating environment. The judge watched the man's every move with barely concealed disdain, like a predator sizing up its prey before the final strike. He had built his reputation by being harsh with those he considered inferior, especially immigrants who, in his warped opinion, didn't deserve the same respect as native-born citizens. His arrogance had grown over the years, fueled by a system that rarely questioned his decisions and by colleagues who preferred to avoid confrontation with his dominant and often cruel personality. At that particular moment, the judge was about to utter words he never imagined would come back to haunt him in such a devastating way. He had no idea he was making the most costly mistake of his entire career, a mistake that would not only destroy his reputation, but also reveal to the entire world the kind of person he truly was behind the respectable black robe. What he didn't know, and what he would discover in a brutally humiliating way, was that this simple, seemingly defenseless man possessed connections that completely transcended anything his arrogant mind could imagine. But what this arrogant judge couldn't even dream of was that, in exactly 22 minutes, a phone call would arrive in that courtroom, a call that would change not only the course of that trial, but also the fate of his own professional life in an irreversible and devastating way. The person on the other end of the line possessed a power he never imagined existed, and was about to use it in a way that would leave permanent scars on his career and reputation. Because you are about to witness one of the most satisfying displays of poetic justice ever to take place inside an American courtroom, a story that proves that sometimes the universe has a very particular way of balancing things out when we least expect it, and that underestimating someone based solely on appearances can have consequences that go far beyond what anyone could anticipate or imagine. This elderly man's story began 50 years ago when he arrived in the United States at just 20 years old, carrying nothing more than a cardboard suitcase and a heart full of dreams and hope. He had left behind a family torn apart by war and a homeland that no longer offered opportunities for people like him. His journey to America had been arduous, marked by months of waiting in refugee camps, endless paperwork, and the constant uncertainty of whether he would be accepted in the country that represented his only chance to start over. During his 5 decades on American soil, he built a dignified existence through honest work and tireless dedication. He began washing dishes in downtown restaurants, worked 12-hour night shifts in factories, and gradually established a small landscaping business that allowed him to support not only his own family, but also help other immigrants who arrived facing the same hardships he had faced decades earlier. His reputation in the community was impeccable, known for his honesty, generosity, and the respect with which he treated everyone, regardless of their social status or background. But there was something about his past that remained carefully guarded, a story he rarely shared, and that most people around him were completely unaware of. During his early years in America, when he was still struggling to learn the language and establish his roots, he had developed an unlikely friendship with a brilliant young law student who worked part-time at the same restaurant where he washed dishes. This friendship had blossomed over the years, maintained through regular correspondence, occasional meetings, and a mutual respect that transcended differences in social class and formal education. On the other side of this story was the judge, a man who had risen to the judiciary through political connections and an uncanny ability to impress the right people at the right times. His career had been marked by controversial decisions, especially when it came to cases involving immigrants, minorities, and people from lower social classes. He had developed a reputation for being ruthless with those he deemed unworthy of his consideration, and his behavior in the courtroom often bordered on abuse of authority, though rarely did anyone have the courage or power to question him directly. Colleagues whispered about his questionable practices in the courtroom. Lawyers avoided confronting him directly for fear of future retaliation, and many people had suffered injustices at his hands simply because they lacked the resources or connections to adequately defend themselves. His arrogance had grown exponentially over the years, fueled by a system that rarely held him accountable for his actions, and a distorted belief that his position entitled him to treat certain people as second-class citizens. On that particular day, these two worlds were about to collide in a way neither could have foreseen. What was about to happen in that courtroom would become a legend whispered among lawyers and court staff for years, a story about how blind arrogance can lead to the most spectacular downfall, and how justice sometimes finds completely unexpected ways to manifest itself definitively and irreversibly. The case had begun as a seemingly straightforward traffic violation, but the judge's handling of the hearing was turning that morning into something much more sinister and troubling. The elderly man had been charged with driving without a valid license, a situation that had arisen due to a bureaucratic misunderstanding regarding his license renewal, something that could have been easily resolved with a little patience and understanding of the specific circumstances of the case. When his name was called, the gentleman slowly rose from his seat, his shaky legs evidencing both his advanced age and the extreme nervousness he felt at that moment. He walked to the front of the courtroom with cautious steps, clearly intimidated by the formal setting and the tense atmosphere that seemed to permeate every inch of the imposing room. His hands remained tightly gripping his hat, a gesture that revealed both respect and a desperate attempt to find something familiar to cling to amidst this completely new and frightening situation. The judge watched him approach with an expression that mixed impatience and barely concealed disdain, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table as he waited for the man to reach the appropriate position before the bench. Even before hearing a single word from the accused, his body language clearly demonstrated that he had formed a preconceived opinion of the case, based purely on the appearance and ethnicity of the defendant before him. When the man finally reached the correct position, the judge didn't even allow him to properly organize himself before beginning to speak in a cutting tone that echoed through the courtroom like a whip. He brusquely questioned why the defendant was wasting the court's precious time on matters that should have been resolved long before they reached this point, without even allowing the man to explain the specific circumstances that had led to this embarrassing situation. The elderly man attempted to respond respectfully, his voice low and hesitant due to both nervousness and his limited English, which became even more pronounced under pressure. He began to explain the confusion with the documents, how he had tried to resolve the situation through the proper channels, but was abruptly interrupted by the judge, who showed extreme irritation at what he considered pathetic excuses and an attempt to waste even more of the court's time. The tension in the courtroom began to rise visibly, with attorneys present exchanging uncomfortable glances, court staffers appearing uneasy in their positions, and spectators in the gallery beginning to murmur quietly about the seemingly unfair way the case was being handled. It was clear to any impartial observer that something was deeply wrong with the way the judge was treating this particular defendant, a glaring disparity compared to the courtesy typically shown to other defendants in similar situations. But this initial display of prejudice and unprofessionalism was only the beginning of an escalation that would become much more intense and disturbing. What no one in that room could have imagined was that every harsh word, every disrespectful gesture, and every display of arrogance was being carefully observed and mentally recorded by forces that would soon reveal themselves to be far more powerful than anyone present could have anticipated at the time. The situation quickly deteriorated when the judge ruled that the elderly man's respectful attempt to explain his situation was, in his words, a deliberate affront to the court's authority and a clear display of disrespect for the American justice system. His voice rose considerably, echoing off the walls of the courtroom with an intensity that caused several people to shift uncomfortably in their seats, while his face began to show signs of anger that seemed completely disproportionate to the simple nature of the case at hand. The judge leaned forward in his chair, pointing his finger accusingly at the defendant as he uttered a series of comments that transcended any reasonable bounds of professional behavior. He openly questioned why people like this man thought they could come to America and ignore the country's laws, suggesting that immigrants like him should be grateful for any opportunity afforded them, rather than create unnecessary problems for a judicial system already overburdened with more important cases. The elderly man stood, clearly shaken by the hostility directed at him, but maintaining a dignified demeanor despite the public humiliation he was suffering. His hands were shaking more visibly now, not just from nervousness, but also from a deeper emotion that mixed sadness, disbelief, and a pain that stemmed from decades of hard work and exemplary behavior being completely ignored in favor of cruel prejudices and unfair generalizations about him and his motivations. The lawyers in the room began exchanging more obviously concerned glances, some whispering quietly among themselves about the blatant impropriety of the judicial behavior they were witnessing. Several of them had practiced law for years in that very courtroom and had rarely seen such an open display of prejudice and abuse of authority, even in the far more controversial and complex cases that frequently passed through that same courtroom. A young, recently graduated lawyer, who was present to observe other cases, began discreetly taking notes on the unfolding events, instinctively realizing he was witnessing something that could have significant ramifications in the future. His limited experience did not prevent him from recognizing that the judge's behavior clearly exceeded the ethical and legal boundaries established for the proper conduct of court hearings. In the gallery, an elderly woman who had accompanied the defendant to court, apparently his wife, clutched her purse tightly to her chest, silent tears welling in her eyes as she watched her husband publicly humiliated by officials who were supposed to represent justice and impartiality. She had lived long enough to recognize injustice when she saw it, and she knew that what was happening in that moment transcended any legitimate legal issue. What made the situation even more tragic was the fact that the man continued to respond to the accusations respectfully and with dignity, never losing his composure or responding with any kind of disrespect, despite the extreme provocation he was facing. His upbringing and deeply ingrained values prevented him from reacting inappropriately, even when faced with treatment that clearly violated basic principles of human decency and due process. But what no one in that room knew was that this display of character under extreme pressure was being watched by eyes that would soon prove capable of ensuring that such injustice would not go unnoticed or without appropriate consequences. The situation reached a new level of outrage when the judge decided to turn this simple case into a public lesson on what he considered the fundamental problem with immigration in the country. His rhetoric became even more inflammatory and personal, directing comments not only at the specific case, but also making cruel generalizations about immigrants in general, suggesting that they represented an unnecessary burden on the system, and that they should be more grateful for the opportunities they received rather than causing problems for hard-working citizens. The elderly man, who had remained respectfully silent throughout most of the tirade, finally politely interrupted to explain that he had attempted to resolve the document issue through the proper channels, but had encountered difficulties due to recent changes in bureaucratic procedures that he hadn't fully understood due to language barriers. His voice was low and humble, clearly trying to diffuse the situation rather than escalate it further. This attempt at explanation, however, was taken by the judge as further provocation, and he exploded in a fury that surprised even the most seasoned court staff, who had seen many tense moments throughout their careers. He slammed his gavel repeatedly on the table, the sound echoing through this room like gunshots, as he shouted that he would no longer tolerate pathetic excuses, and that he was tired of people coming to his courtroom trying to game the system, with elaborate stories of misunderstandings and bureaucratic snafus. The atmosphere in the room became almost suffocating, with a palpable tension that made people shift nervously in their seats. Several spectators began to whisper among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the direction events were taking, while some lawyers present began to consider whether they should intervene in some way, despite the professional risks such action could pose to their own future careers. What made the situation even more painful to watch was the stark contrast between the defendant's silent dignity and the judge's completely disproportionate emotional outburst. The elderly man stood, clearly shaken but maintaining his composure, his hand still respectfully holding his hat, as the judge continued his tirade about how people like him should learn to show more respect for American authority and the institutions that generously allowed them to remain in the country. In one particularly shocking moment, the judge openly suggested that perhaps the defendant should consider returning to his home country if he couldn't follow simple rules like maintaining proper documentation, a comment that caused several people in the gallery to whisper indignantly, and at least 2 lawyers to scribble furiously in their notebooks. This kind of language clearly transcended any proper professional boundaries and entered territory that could be considered ethnic persecution. But what the judge failed to realize in his blind arrogance and self-destructive rage was that his performance was being observed by someone who possessed not only the power, but also the determination to ensure that his words and actions would have consequences that extended far beyond that courtroom. The invisible web of connections and loyalties he had completely underestimated was about to manifest in a way that would transform this moment of perceived triumph into a professional catastrophe of epic proportions. It was precisely at this moment of maximum tension and humiliation that the court telephone began to ring, with an insistence that cut through the charged atmosphere like a sharp blade. The piercing sound echoed through the room, abruptly interrupting the judge's diatribe and creating a sudden, unexpected moment of silence that caused all heads to turn toward the receiver. The clerk responsible for answering calls during the sessions hesitated for a moment, clearly reluctant to interrupt what seemed like a crucial moment in the judicial proceedings. The judge, Irritated by what he considered a completely inappropriate interruption, impatiently gestured for the call to be ignored, wanting to continue his display of authority without further unnecessary distractions. However, the phone continued to ring with a persistence that suggested extreme urgency, and finally the clerk decided to answer, whispering discreetly to the person on the other end of the line before his expression changed dramatically, his eyes widening with what appeared to be a mixture of surprise and genuine concern. The clerk hesitantly approached the judge's bench, clearly nervous about interrupting the session, but with an urgency in his movements that indicated the call was of an extraordinarily important nature. He whispered something in the judge's ear, and immediately the expression of arrogant fury on the judicial official's face began to transform into something else entirely. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally a kind of pallor that suggested he had just received news that fundamentally changed his understanding of the situation. The judge picked up the phone with hands that now trembled slightly, a dramatic change from the absolute confidence he had displayed just moments before. His voice, which had been loud and authoritative throughout the hearing, suddenly became low and cautious as he spoke to the person on the other end of the line. The people in the room couldn't hear the specific conversation, but the judge's body language was visibly changing with each passing second. During the first moments of the call, he still tried to maintain an authoritative tone, likely explaining the situation from his perspective and perhaps even hoping for support for his actions. However, as the conversation progressed, his posture became progressively more defensive, his answers became shorter and more hesitant, and his facial expression evolved from confidence to concern, then to something approaching genuine panic. The elderly man, who had remained standing throughout this unexpected interaction, watched the transformation with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but his life experience told him that something significant had shifted in the dynamic of the room, something that could potentially alter the course of the entire traumatic experience he was experiencing. The attorneys and spectators present also noticed the dramatic change in the judge's demeanor, and a low murmur of curiosity and speculation began to run through the room. It was obvious to any observer that the call was revealing information the judge was not prepared to hear, information that was forcing him to reconsider not only his actions that day, but possibly his entire approach to the case and the defendant before him. When the judge finally hung up the phone, the silence in the room was deafening, thick with anticipation and tension about what would happen next. The silence that followed the end of the phone call was broken by the judge's voice, but now completely transformed. Where once there had been arrogance and authority, there was now only a tremulous hesitation that revealed a man confronting the imminent collapse of everything he had built throughout his career. He looked at the elderly man with eyes that now held a terrifying understanding of who truly stood before him, and of the catastrophic error he had made in judging someone purely by their appearance and background. The call had come directly from the office of the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, an authority with the power not only to terminate the judicial career of any judge under his jurisdiction, but also to initiate investigations that could result in criminal consequences for abuse of authority. What the judge discovered during this devastating conversation was that the humble man he had spent the last 30 minutes publicly humiliating was, in fact, the Chief Justice's adoptive father, a relationship that had been kept discreet due to the private nature of both parties involved. The story behind this extraordinary connection was one of the most touching imaginable. Decades ago, when the future Chief Justice was just a young law student struggling to pay his tuition, he had met this hard-working immigrant during a particularly difficult period in his life. The young student had faced severe financial problems and was considering abandoning his legal dreams when the elderly man, recognizing his potential and dedication, offered not only emotional support, but also practical financial assistance that enabled him to continue his studies. More than that, the immigrant had become a father figure to the young man, offering guidance, wisdom, and an example of integrity that profoundly shaped the values and principles the future judge would carry into his own career. Over the years, even as the student became a successful lawyer and later a respected judge, their relationship remained strong, based on mutual respect and a genuine love that transcended any differences in social status or formal education. The Chief Justice had explained during the call that he was aware of his adoptive father's documentation issues and had personally recommended that he appear in court that day to resolve the matter simply and respectfully. The expectation was that the case would be treated as the minor bureaucratic matter it truly was, not as an opportunity for a judge to exercise personal bias and demonstrate blatant abuse of power against a man whose contribution to American society had been immeasurable. The consequences were immediate and devastating. During the call itself, The judge was informed that a formal investigation into his behavior would be launched immediately, that he was being suspended from all judicial duties until further notice, and that the case would be immediately transferred to another court where it would receive the appropriate and respectful treatment it should have received from the beginning. More than that, the Chief Justice had made it clear that every word uttered in that courtroom had been inappropriate and potentially criminal, representing a not only professional misconduct, but also a possible violation of the defendant's civil rights. The career the judge had built over decades was now in complete ruins, destroyed in a matter of minutes by his own arrogance and inability to treat all citizens with the dignity and respect they deserved. In the days following that devastating moment in the courtroom, the consequences of judicial arrogance unfolded like an unstoppable avalanche, completely transforming the lives of everyone involved. News of the incident spread rapidly through legal circles, first as quiet whispers among lawyers and staff, then as headlines in local newspapers, and finally as a national story about abuse of power and the importance of treating all citizens with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance. The formal investigation into the judge's conduct revealed that the incident with the elderly man was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior that had persisted over the years. Other cases were reviewed, witnesses came forward, and a picture emerged of a judge who had repeatedly used his position to humiliate and mistreat people he considered inferior, particularly immigrants, minorities, and individuals from lower social classes. The disciplinary process resulted not only in the judge's permanent removal from office, but also in criminal charges for violating civil rights under lawful authority, a federal crime that carried both significant financial penalties and the possibility of imprisonment. His license to practice law was revoked, his reputation was completely destroyed, and he found himself facing civil lawsuits from several of the people he had mistreated throughout his career. Meanwhile, the elderly man unwittingly became a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity and a powerful example of why the judicial system must treat all citizens with equal respect. His story, from arriving as a refugee to becoming a respected member of the community who had helped shape the career of one of the state's most prominent judges, was chronicled in newspaper articles and television programs, and became a case study in law schools on the importance of judicial impartiality. The Chief Justice used the incident as an opportunity to implement sweeping reforms to the state's judicial system, including mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all judges, improved procedures for reporting judicial misconduct, and a more robust system of oversight to ensure that such abuses of power could not occur in the future without immediate consequences. The elderly man, for his part, maintained the same dignity and humility he had demonstrated during his most difficult time. When offered the opportunity to speak publicly about his experience, he chose to focus not on the injustice he had suffered, but on the importance of maintaining faith in the system when it works properly, and the need for all Americans, whether born in the country or naturalized, to be treated with the basic respect that defines a truly just society. His wife, who had silently watched the humiliation in court, became a quiet but effective advocate for the rights of elderly immigrants, working with community organizations to ensure that others in similar situations received adequate support and guidance on their legal rights. She transformed her pain into purpose, using the traumatic experience as motivation to help others who might face similar discrimination in the justice system. The most notable transformation, however, occurred in the very atmosphere of the courtroom where it all happened. The staff, lawyers, and other judges who had witnessed the incident became much more vigilant about issues of fair treatment and judicial dignity. The case became a constant reference, a permanent reminder of how arrogance and prejudice can destroy careers and, more importantly, cause profound harm to innocent people who were simply seeking justice. Months later, when the new judge appointed to fill the vacant position held his first hearing in the same room where the injustice had occurred, he made a point of mentioning in his opening remarks that all citizens would be treated with equal respect and dignity in his courtroom, regardless of their origin, language, or socioeconomic status. This statement was met with silent but significant approval from all present, who understood the implicit reference to the events that had transformed that space. The story became a powerful legend about poetic justice, how the universe sometimes finds ways to balance things out when we least expect it, and the fundamental importance of never judging a person by their appearance or assuming we know their full story. It served as a lasting reminder that true strength of character often resides in those who appear most humble, and that arrogance based on positions of power can be the seed of one's own destruction. For the elderly man, the experience, though traumatic, became a final validation of a life lived with integrity and dignity. He had faced discrimination and injustice with the same grace he had demonstrated through decades of hard work and quiet contribution to his adopted community. His response to the abuse, maintaining his composure, treating even his abuser with respect, and subsequently using the situation to educate others about tolerance and justice, demonstrated the kind of character that had impressed a young law student decades ago and would continue to inspire people for generations. History's most profound lesson transcended questions of the justice system or immigration, becoming a powerful testament to the importance of treating every person we encounter with basic dignity and respect. It proved that we never truly know who stands before us, that invisible connections shape our lives in ways we cannot imagine, and that true justice, though sometimes slow in coming, eventually prevails when we least expect it, transforming moments of humiliation into definitive victories of the human spirit over arrogance and prejudice.